Hey guys, Kuzo here, back with another video, and in this video today we're going to be drawing a splash page of all the 7 deadly sins. Unlike the splash pages that I did in the epic series that I started where I draw 10 anime characters from just other random series all on one page, this specific splash page is going to be a little bit more streamlined with a little bit more composition and stuff like that. Like with my other ones from my epic series, it's more like kind of a collage kind of splash page. So essentially this one's a little bit more thought out and kind of meticulous on where I wanted to put the characters and everything like that, having them kind of pop out from the page. The thing I was really excited about when starting this was being able to actually try out some more dynamic poses and stuff like that, because as you guys know from my redesign series, I like to keep the redesign series poses a lot more stagnant so you can see most of the design, since it's all about redesigning the character mostly. So, but in this one, you know, the character designs are already created, so I can kind of play around with the poses and make them a little bit more dynamic, and it's more about like the overall feel of the page and the characters kind of coming together. Not to mention the fact that they're all the 7 deadly sins, it makes it all nice and cohesive with, you know, it all being part of one story. So that's going to be really fun, being able to see it come all together at the end. Since I know some of you guys will be wondering and asking, I'll let you know what kind of pencil I'm using. I'm using a 0.7 Bic pencil, and essentially it's just a really cheap pencil, just in case you don't live in the States or something, and by some chance in your country the Bic pencil is not sold there. It's really just a cheap pencil, and these are disposable pencils, so I pretty much just throw them away afterwards. I don't refill them or anything. I get like I think it's like a 10 or 12 pack or something like that, and I just use them until they run out. And for the lead that's in the pencil, it's just the lead that comes with the pencil, and it's just a medium weight lead, which is pretty much the same kind of lead that comes in every kind of like cheap mechanical pencil, because they don't want to give you something too light or too heavy, so they just give you a medium weight by default. One thing I'd like to mention is I really do like smooth paper, and I think smooth paper is really what makes the difference when sketching. At least for me, I don't like rough paper. The smooth paper just feels so buttery smooth, and it makes your lines feel a lot more soft. Yeah, go out and get some cheap pencils and then try to find some smooth paper and you'll be golden. And if you don't have smooth paper, that's completely fine. I have some sketchbooks that have some like semi-rough paper, and I just use them for sketching and stuff like that. And I mean, I know these are sketches too as well, but there's a lot for practicing and character designs and stuff like that. The question I get asked a lot that I wanted to answer was, do I use reference when drawing? And the answer is no, I do not. I only use reference when I'm actually practicing or doing studies and stuff like that, because that's when I'm actually trying to learn those things, so that way I can end up using them in illustrations like this. So basically I want to learn the fundamentals on why things can look the way they do, so that way I don't ever really have to use reference for illustrations. Obviously the difference between using reference for poses and stuff and using reference for uniforms and costumes. Like for example, for this I had to, you know, search up the characters to make sure I was drawing their costumes correctly, but no, I did not use reference for poses and stuff like that. Basically where I come from on that is when it's a finished illustration that I'm going to be posting around saying I drew this, I really don't want there to be reference involved, because I want it to be literally me drawing it and not, you know, taking any reference, because I feel like that would make the illustration a little bit less of my own. But for example, if I am having a hard time with something, what I will do is go onto a separate page and kind of practice it, and you know, do a little bit of studies to make sure I can try to get that specific pose down. Or if I'm having a hard time with the hand or something, I'll practice it off to the side and do some studies, so that way I can try to learn what I'm doing wrong so I can draw it correctly on the illustration. Yeah, the subject of using reference is a strange subject for me, because there's also the idea that if you're using reference and then you end up changing it up enough, that technically it ends up becoming your own at the end. And a lot of people end up using this method in order to create a new piece as well as learn from what they're just studying. But that's something I like to try to be careful of a lot, because if that ends up becoming a process of yours that you end up using reference on each illustration, that means you're gonna kind of handicap yourself to the idea of using a reference for each illustration. And like, for example, with a manga, when you're doing manga, there's not gonna be reference for every single panel that you draw. So you're gonna want to learn how to draw the majority of everything you draw on your own. And I guess what I mean by that is, since you can technically just go and study and do the same thing, is when you're doing an actual illustration, if it becomes part of your actual process, your brain might end up getting used to letting the base image come from something else. So when you go to draw on your own and you're not actually trying to remember the whole process that you went through in order to get to that end part and the beginning part of it, it'll end up becoming a process that sticks around, and you won't be able to reproduce it on your own without a sort of reference. So that's kind of what I mean by that. Yeah, like I said, the whole topic of using reference for your own illustrations is a very interesting topic, and you know, a lot of people have their own view on it. But yeah, this is just my view on it. If someone else has a different view, that's completely fine. This is just the view that I feel like helps me get as far as I want to go, you know, with my learning process and stuff like that. So in any case, let's move on and maybe talk a little bit about the illustration. And here we're doing some work on King, and with King's pose, I didn't really want to go too crazy with it because he's like the middle pose, and I felt like if I put the staff in too many different positions, the staff would be kind of, you know, overlapping with the other characters in some sort of strange way. So I ended up just going with this kind of, you know, poking out pose with the staff. That sounds kind of weird the way I put it. I could have been a little bit more dynamic with this pose, had him doing something a little bit more interactive with that whole staff thing, but I kind of played it safe with that pose, to be completely honest. Like, if I keep on doing illustrations like this, the kind of meticulous, thought out splash pages, I feel like I'll be able to experiment with this poses a little bit more than I did in this one. Like Gowther here, his pose is pretty standard, you know, pretty simple for a person who has a bow and arrow. I thought about having him holding it, you know, as if he was going to be shooting it, but I also wanted to think about the composition, because if I pulled him inwards, he might be touching Diane's knees, and then I didn't know where I was going to be putting the bow and arrow, because if I had him pointing it downward, it would end up going into Bond. So I just kind of had him holding it behind his head. I could have tried to work out the poses a little bit more, but I was pretty happy when I did this as the first draft. So this is pretty much all the poses I did in the first draft. First draft is just a thumbnail version where it's just basically shape based, and I wanted to make sure I knew where all 7 of the people would be laid out to get the overall feeling of it. And now we moved on to Escanor. So at this stage of the illustration, I pretty much already have all the poses down and stuff. That's one of the first things I wanted to do, was get the overall general shape down and all the poses down, so that way I could then go in and focus on the details such as face structure and, you know, what they're wearing, the weapons and stuff like that. So we're kind of in the stage of just really making the character look like the character now. With Escanor, I kind of had a hard time deciding if I wanted him to have a shirt on, if I wanted to have his shirt ripping off, if I wanted him to have, you know, like armor on, but I ended up going with like a little bit of a shirt ripping off, like it's already pretty much all ripped off. And yeah, I feel like I could have thought out his pose and everything a little bit more. But now we're moving on to Merlin, going off that base pose that I had, so I could just lay on all the expressions and make the character look like the character. One thing I consciously was thinking of when I went into this was I wanted to make the clothes wrinkles on all the characters in here a little bit more simplistic than I typically think of them, because I feel like one of the things I do is I try to think of them a little bit too complicated when they need to be a little bit simpler for what I'm doing. One of the key points to this whole illustration that I was thinking when I was drawing this was try not to overthink everything that I'm doing and just have fun and things a little bit more simple, so that way, you know, I can build upon the process. Also, another thing I didn't know if I wanted to do with this illustration was a lot of, you know, detail shading with stuff. And with the blacks, I hadn't decided yet if I wanted to make the blacks solid blacks or if I wanted to actually put extra shades within the blacks on the characters. Wasn't sure yet because there are illustrations that I don't really want to go that detailed with the blacks and stuff like that. I just kind of want to fill it in with kind of like a scribble fill in. Which in the end I ended up going with the balance of the two, where I didn't go too detailed with the blacks and also just in general the shades, and I didn't go too under detailed with it. Typically when it's an illustration that I know I'm going to be going straight into ink, I definitely go less detailed with everything, because when I end up going into inks, I'm going to be getting rid of that whole, black areas anyways, and typically I won't even, fill in the dark areas unless it's a really quick scribble. Because, for example, if it's traditional, you'll end up just erasing all the pencils, so there would be no point in filling in the blacks. But the only point to fill in the blacks when you're going to go straight into ink and color and stuff like that, and you'd be erasing all the pencil, is essentially to kind of get the composition feel of where the darks and light spots would be for contrast and stuff like that. So there is a point to actually filling in the blacks. It's just you don't have to fill them in so dark that when you erase it, they end up staying behind for the actual ink portion and color portion. That even my traditional works, most of them I end up just inking and coloring digitally. I still think of it as a traditional process, because when I go back to traditional and stuff like that, I don't want my process to change from digital to traditional. There are some, a few key advantages that I do use in digital work, but all in all, I don't want it to be something that impacts my process so much that I have to change my whole flow when going between the two. For example, with this illustration, if I did go to actually ink and finish and color this illustration, what I would probably end up doing is changing the size of some of the characters in digital so that way they fit a little bit better on this whole, splash page. There are some gaps between the characters that I don't really like, but I was already so far into the illustration that I can't really change that, so I ended up just committing to that. This is also something that I've always tried to keep true to my digital illustration, is I try to keep the original pose, or if I'm going to redraw something, I'm really going to redraw it. But there are some times where I do end up, selecting and moving characters and stuff like that just to make a process go faster. But in general, in my mind, I try to make sure that what I'm drawing is going to be, what's going to stay there. Or at least if I do want to change it, actually redraw it instead of moving a bunch of stuff around digitally, because if that actually becomes a part of your process too much, it'll end up becoming a handicap. And that's something I really don't want, because, if you go to draw something traditionally, then you won't be used to actually redrawing it. And, for example, if I need to change something here, traditionally I can't move it. I'm going to have to erase it and redraw it. So I just want to be used to having to redraw something. Alrighty, and let's talk about Meliodas a little bit. So like in the very beginning, I actually had his pose a little bit different because I actually had him holding the sword with the wrong arm. I had him holding the sword with his left arm when all the pictures that I saw he was holding it with his right arm, so I ended up having to change up his pose a little bit, which is actually a good thing because I actually like this pose a lot more. It kind of, singles out his sword, it becomes, a focal point, and it looks a lot cooler than it did before, because before he was holding the sword around to his, he was holding it over his left hand side, which means most of his sword would be kind of gone and unseen. I thought it was a really fun pose change. I'm not gonna lie, when I found out I had to change the pose, it was already really set in my head, and I was actually a little bit anxious about changing it. But one thing I've been working on recently is getting over the fear of trying to do something different. I almost thought about just keeping it in his left hand, but I was like, I have to change it. And really jump in head first to try to get something new and different, and just experiment, be open-minded, because if we're too tense about it, we'll end up, our drawing will end up coming out a little bit tense as well, and it'll show through the drawing, and it'll end up becoming a little bit stiff. So I've been trying to, not shy away from having to change something. Now we're on Bon. Bon's jacket is red, and in the manga it definitely shows up as a very heavy black. I decided not to go completely heavy black on it because, I don't know, he would have stood out way too much compared to all the, other characters, because this is one of those things I was talking about earlier, was I didn't know how much of the blacks I actually wanted to go into and how much detail into the blacks I wanted to go into. I ended up going a little bit lighter on the blacks with Bon. So now we're at the part of the illustration that I didn't know if I was actually going to be doing a lot of, but I decided to do a little bit more shading than I was anticipating, but it's also still a little bit less shading than I would do on like a redesign drawing. Really didn't want to go that detailed with all of the shading because there's so many characters here. If I would have gone too detailed with the shading, I feel like it would have become a little bit too busy of an image. So I wanted to go a little bit simpler. So you can see that I'm doing shades and stuff like that, but I kept it simple for the most part. I actually had a whole lot of fun with this illustration. Drawing all the characters in general was just really fun, but it was also a really good practice because I want to get used to being able to draw a lot of characters on one page and be able to do it faster and faster, really. And also be able to think of the general poses in the whole illustration a lot faster. But in any case, if you guys like what I do in this channel and want to help support my artists, you can check me out on my Patreon, link in the description. But in any case, I'd like to take this time to thank my current Patreons. 19 Black Dragon 89, Aaliyah Williams, Aaron McQuiston, Alpha Dog Studios, Anya, Benjamin Thoma, Connor, Daniel Hillier, Daniel Hutchinson, Dope Closet, Grimoff, Ian Dobb, Joe, Johnny Boy Draws, Josh Aguilera, JT, Kyla Smith, Leo McIntyre, Licour, Marek Karaz, Maracuzio, Monso, Nate Lee, Noah Henderson, Prathana, Ryan, Satoshi, Slow Days, Safine, Spencer Davis, Arjun, Wear My Crown, Wes Fletcher, William, and Woody Olis. You guys are the best pencil snowbies there are and help me be able to do what I do on this channel. But in any case, if you guys like this video, please hit that thumbs up button. And if you're new to this channel, like what you see, please subscribe, hit the bell icon to get notified when each video comes out. Like always guys, hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.